All right, tonight we will resume our study in the book of Judges. This is the Moorhead Church of Christ Wednesday evening Bible study. And we are now in chapter 5. And we will recall that this book is really highlighting for us really one of the worst periods in the history of Israel. They are really not in the best position that they've been in, and they don't seem to be making good choices. I mean, Joshua was their leader. After Joshua passed, they were really doing well for a while, and after a while, being in the promised land, instead of being devoted to God and really striving to please God, what happened is they essentially got themselves involved with idolatry of the peoples that remained, that they had failed to drive out. And so it is really a sad thing to see this kind of things happening in the Old Testament. And so we think about the value of the Old Testament. The value is that even when God's people are at their worst, we can learn from them really what not to do. And we can learn that God, when man turns around and comes back to God, that God is very gracious and welcoming. And so there's a lot of things that we learn about the people of God as well as God himself from books such as the book of Judah. We are in chapter 5, and you'll recall that there is a situation in chapter 4 where the children of Israel had really that third cycle where they fell away from God. They got themselves involved with evil, really tied to the idolatry. They were oppressed by some of the remnants of the land that were left behind, and they cried out to the Lord, and at some point the Lord sent the deliverers. And in this case, in that third cycle, it was Ehud. After Ehud had died, then they sent Deborah, and Deborah chose Barak essentially to help really overthrowing really that oppression that they were under. And so Judges chapter 4 is really the historical event of God's people essentially getting their spiritual house in order and God helping them to defeat the Canaanites who had been oppressing them for 20 years. So chapter 5, unlike a lot of the other books or chapters that we're going to read in the book of Judges, is really the same event of chapter 4, but it's put to song. And so what we have here is a song of victory, really highlighting really the events of what happened in chapter 4. And you know, we think about the power of song, and you know, we're aware of after the fact that Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper, that he and his disciples, they sang a hymn. There is something about gaining the knowledge of Scripture and the insight of Scripture and the wisdom of Scripture, but there's also something to be said about song. And it really seems to sort of the idea of really being more so to our emotions and, you know, putting historical things in relation to a more moving emotional aspect. And so what we know about the Israelites and singing these songs is not something we read a lot about in Scripture, but you know, it's really based on really celebrating a victory in this case, or religious experience. So chapter 5 is really a duet. So the song, of course, comes from Deborah, but it's her and Barak that are singing this song. And so I'm not going to cover everything that I did last week, but I want to bring us up to about verse 14. And so they're singing this song, and really Deborah is praising the leaders of Israel for really stepping up and carrying out this great defeat. And she really draws her attention to the praise of God, because really it is God that brought about the defeat. Verse 4, so the idea that God is sort of gives this picture of God sort of marching from Eden to really battle against the Canaanites. And it talks about really the fact of their oppression there in verses 6 and 7. And then it talks about really the reason why they were oppressed, because the Israelites had got new gods. It wasn't the God that brought them out of Israel. It's not the God that led them through the wilderness. It's not the God that was with them in conquering the promised land. But these are talking about the idolatry they involved themselves with. And the idea is that they became weak before their enemies. And that's why their enemies were able to harshly treat them. And so what we have here is recounting really that oppression, and really the joy of now the fact that all of the oppression has been thrown off. Verse 12 starts another section where it's talking about all of the different tribes being brought together for this battle. Back in chapter 4, there's only two that are specifically mentioned in verse 6, and that is Naphtali and Zebulun. But it's clear in the song that others had a part in this battle, and so they had to get the 10,000, and so there's very much is they had beyond what that number of 10,000 for these other tribes that came to the battle. And so we will start reading at verse 12 all the way down through 18. Ryan, would you like to read that for us? 12 through 18?
12 through 18? Sure.
Yeah.
So, chapter 5, 12 through 18.
Yep.
Okay. Awake, awake, Deborah. Awake, awake. Sing a song. Arise, Barak, and take away your captives, O son of Abinoam. Then survivors came down to the nobles. The people of the Lord came down to me as warriors. From Ephraim, those whose root is in Amalek came down, following you, Benjamin, with your peoples. From Machir, commanders came down, and from Zebulun, those who wield the staff of office. And the princes of Issachar were with Deborah, as was Issachar, so was Barak. Into the valley they rushed at his heels. Among the divisions of Reuben, there were great resolves of heart. Why did you sit among the sheepfolds to hear the piping for the flocks? Among the divisions of Reuben, there were great searchings of heart. Gilead remained across the Jordan, and why did Dan stay in ships? Asher sat at the seashore and remained by its landings. Zebulun was a people who despised their lives even to death, and Naphtali also on the high places of the field. Okay, so really the song now is going to highlight the tribes that were part of this battle, and so you're going to see that when Barak went into battle, he had men from the tribe of Ephraim, verse 14, also Benjamin. And then it says in verse 14, from Machir, commanders came down, and this is really a poetic reference to Manasseh. So we're talking about the tribe of Manasseh. Then he talks about from Zebulun. So we have Zebulun. So he's really noting all of the people that came for that battle. Then in verse 15 he says, and the princes of Issachar were with Deborah, as was Issachar, so was Barak. Into the valley they rushed at his heels. And so now we have the mention of Issachar. And then after really commending all of those tribes that had come out to the battle, believe it or not, there were tribes that apparently knew about the battle, but essentially decided to sit the battle out. And so we talk about naming names here. The prophetess Deborah is going to name names, is going to really call out these tribes. And so you see at the end of verse 15, among the divisions of Reuben, there was great resolves of heart. And that line will be used again
in verse 16. Why did you sit among the sheepfolds to hear the piping for the flocks among the divisions of Reuben? And this really seems to be scolding them because essentially they were a no-show. And what is drawing attention to is the fact that there's really no reason that was really given for them to be absent from this battle. This battle was not just for some of the tribes against their enemies. It wasn't just for some of them, but the idea is these were really the Israelites as a whole. This was their enemy that had oppressed them for 20 years, and they should have came together to defeat him. Right?
What does it mean by resolves of heart?
Resolved of heart. Let me just kind of look here.
Is that like they were scared, or?
Let me see here. Resolves here. And the Hebrew word is talking about action prescribed for oneself. Resolves of the mind. And then it talks about verse 16. It talks about there were great searchings of the heart. And so, what it seems to be is it's really whether or not they're sort of contemplating whether, whatever it is that's sort of keeping them from going. In other words, are they, considering it, or, are they're essentially really finding reasons not to go. I mean, it's not clear exactly what that means, but the idea seems to be, they really, instead of grabbing their weapons and going to fight, they seem to be laying back and
maybe like a laziness thing then, or kind of like.
Well, when I was kind of looking at some of the commentaries, they didn't have a lot to say about it, but it sort of seems to be that since they didn't go, perhaps they were considering, if it was in their best interest as a tribe, or it was going to cost them more to go into battle than if they stayed. It's sort of like they're sort of going through it in their minds, but the end result is no action. So they have an opportunity to do the right thing, but instead of going, the idea they're talking about whatever it is, the idea here of the great resolves of the heart, because she's asking, there were great resolves of the heart, and then she says, verse 16, there were great searchings of the heart. In other words, whatever that means, the idea is were they contemplating and they just failed to go? We don't know exactly what's meant by that, but it's obvious that they didn't go. That whatever that is they just didn't take action, and that's really the failure. So she essentially scolds Reuben because Reuben could have acted but didn't act. And so they're talking about why you're sort of sitting, among the sheepfolds. And you remember that's sort of the place where it's sort of a pen where you put the sheep in for their protection, and hearing the bleating of the sheep. What are you doing? Why didn't you act? Why did you do this instead of essentially go and fight for Israel? So not only that, but he talks about Gilead in verse 17. So Gilead is a place that's associated with Gad. So in other words, it's used for really the tribe of Gad itself. And so Gilead is within Gad, and so the idea is it's a major city. Why is Gad absent? Why didn't they show up? And then he goes on to verse 17, Dan. He's talking about another tribe. So if you're looking down the 12 tribes, you're saying these guys were here, these guys were here, these guys check. Okay, Reuben's not here. Question mark. Why? Why isn't Reuben? Searching's the heart. Okay, what's Reuben? Okay, why isn't Gad here? Okay, why isn't Dan here? Why isn't Asher here? And the idea is they stayed in their ships. They stayed busy doing whatever they were doing back home. Asher sat at the seashore, remained by its landing, so it seems to be where the ships come to the dock. But the idea is they didn't act, and it's really showing the good guys, the guys that did what they should have done, versus those who didn't come to the battle.
Some of these tribes like Asher and Gad, were they like not faithful to God compared to the ones who actually went into battle?
Well, they were, they all had troubles with faithfulness to God, but this is really specifically dealing with this battle. In other words, they were no-shows at the battle. So, you know, God gave them a deliverer. The deliverer was Deborah. Deborah appointed Barak to be the commander. Go get yourself 10,000 men from Naphtali and Zebulun. He does that. Then we have all these other tribes showing up, and then you have really these other Israelite tribes, and it really makes them look bad, because it's like, this is our enemy. You should have been involved with our fight, but for whatever reason you stayed home. And it's really just in this incident, because none of them, you know, we read in chapter 1, they all kind of had issues in their faithfulness to God, but this is really about this battle that they didn't show for.
It kind of like as an analogy, it kind of seems like it's like, you know, these 12 tribes of Israel were almost like individual states or something, and then it's like, if you were to make the example like of America in World War II,
Yeah.
it'd be like only some of the states were
Right.
sending troops to go fight, and others
Right.
are like, nah, you guys go ahead and we'll skip it. It's kind of weird. It's not like
And
a
you-
unified country.
Right, so you have a kind of a different circumstance. So Joshua's out of the picture. They really have no national leader. So Joshua was the last national leader. We don't have a national leader again until the first king, which is Samuel, or Saul, King Saul. Okay, so now we sort of have these sort of act like states, like states within, you know, the United States, essentially, you know, being run by a governor. So everybody's sort of doing their own thing instead of working collectively for what is supposed to happen. That promised land was supposed to be for God's people, and all the enemies were to be driven out. And so they may have got their act together here. It seemed very much the idea is they got their act together, everybody should have got on board. Everybody who is a tribe of Israel should have showed up for this battle.
Yeah.
And they had no excuse. And so the song is, Deborah and Barak are singing about commending those tribes that came and really shaming those, naming names for those who didn't come. And so we'd like to wonder, you know, when this song was known to them, what was their reaction? And the reaction should be is they were shamed, and they were going to change their ways.
I'll say even, you know, up ahead here in verse 18, like,
Yeah.
they despise their lives. Like, what does that even mean, you know?
Yeah. So after sort of shaming the ones that didn't show up, this goes back to chapter 4, verses 6, where those first 10,000 men came. It came from the tribe of Zebulun and Naphtali. And really what it is so you're saying the good guys that came out, you're shaming those didn't, and then you're really adding to the shame of those who didn't come by essentially saying those from the tribe of Zebulun and Naphtali, they were so devoted to the cause of battling against the Canaanites that they were willing essentially to fight to the death. I mean, these are the real heroes of the show. These are the ones that were volunteered before anybody else got on board. And so this should add more shame to the fact of these guys that didn't even bother to show up. These guys were willing to sort of put their lives on the line and give their all really in service to the nation of Israel. So verse 19. So we're going to read 19 through 23. We're going to start a new section here. And it says, Deborah is singing here, and Barak is saying, the kings came and fought, then fought the kings of Canaan at Tanakh, near the waters of Megiddo. They took no plunder in silver. The stars fought from heaven, from their courses. They fought against Sisera. The torrent of Kishon swept them away. The ancient torrent, the torrent of Kishon. O my soul, march on with strength. Then the horses' hooves beat from the dashing of his valiant steeds. Curse Meroz, said the angel of the Lord, utterly curse its inhabitants because they did not come to help. of the Lord, to the help of the Lord against the warriors. So this one's a little bit trickier to try to understand, but really what it's talking about here is about the battle. So now we're talking about the actual battle itself in poetic sort of language. They're singing about it, so it's talked about differently than the chapter 4. And just a little bit about Taanach here. Taanach, we don't know what the meaning is, an ancient royal city of the Canaanites, whose king was conquered and slain by Joshua, but whose inhabitants were not driven out of the land. And Taanach was occupied by the tribe of Manasseh. So we essentially have people, these Canaanites, that have reoccupied some of those places that they initially lost early on into the conquering of the Promised Land. And then it mentions Megiddo, and this is a royal city of the Canaanites. The king of the Canaanites in the city was slain by Joshua, Joshua 12, verse 21. Megiddo was within the territory of Issachar. So we kind of get an idea where these places are. That's from the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia. And I liked what here at this verse here, verse 19, Jameson, Faust, and Brown, their commentary on Judges here says, the kings came to fight. This describes the scene of the battle and the issue. It would seem, Judges 5:19, that Jabin was reinforced by troops of other Canaanite princes. The battlefield was near Taanach, on its southwestern extremity by the left bank of Kishon, and they took no grain of money, they obtained no plunder. In other words, they came out, they had the impression that, they had the upper hand. Remember, these guys had 900 chariots of iron. I mean, when you see 900 chariots of iron, and you have an Israelite army that's underprepared for this kind of battle, this should essentially be something that results in great slaughter and great plunder. The problem with it is, it turns out to be just the opposite occasion. In other words, those who were the favored ones to win essentially are defeated by Israel, which is the underdog, and it's only because, of course, God was fighting for them against the Canaanites. How do we know that? Well, in poetic language, in verse 20, it says, the stars fought from heaven, from their courses, they fought against Sisera. And so the idea is that God is fighting against them. So if God is fighting against the Canaanites, and they have the 900 iron chariots, remember the idea of the water being unleashed and the chariots sort of sinking into the silt once it becomes wet. The idea is all of a sudden he's routed this entire army, and they essentially are going to be destroyed because God is with Israel. Verse 21 says, the torrent of Kishon swept them away, the ancient torrent, the torrent of Kishon, O my soul, march on. And so we're talking about, according to Nelson's Illustrated Bible Dictionary, this Kishon River, a river in Palestine which flows from the sources on Mount Tabor and Mount Gilboa westward through the plain of Esdraelon and the valley of Jezreel, then empties into the Mediterranean Sea near the northern base of Mount Carmel. Because the Kishon falls slightly as it crosses the level plain, it often becomes swollen and floods much of the valley during the season of heavy rains. And so it was dry at the time. They were not expecting what God did. God unleashed really thunderstorms, heavy thunderstorms, really to change the whole dynamic of this battle. They didn't see it coming. And so God was fighting for Israel. What we have here at the last part of verse 21, Deborah singing, O my soul, march on in strength. And so Deborah is greatly encouraged by the victorious outcome of the battle, and really this is a jubilant cry of victory. The idea is God sort of brought about what could have been a catastrophic disaster for Israel became really a disaster for the Canaanites. Any questions about that? Okay, verse 22, and we're talking really about the defeat. We're still reading about the defeat of the Canaanites. This is the Canaanites here, their horses. Then the horses' hooves beat from the dashing of valiant steeds. And really, we're talking about the mighty ones riding the horses. And this verse mentions the fact that the horses are dashing about, which is talking about the routing of Sisera, the idea of defeating them, and they're going into retreat by the Lord in Judges 4 and verse 15 by the element of surprise. They never expected this other dynamic to the battle. They thought, we're going to go up there. Okay, Israel is Mount Tabor. We're going to go up there. We're going to fight. But they never saw this coming. And it essentially... everything unraveled for them. Essentially, the troops are going to be destroyed, and all that's going to be left is Sisera. That's how great that the battle was against Israel. Okay, any questions about really that battle scene? Okay, so verse 23 is something altogether different here. It says, "Curse Meroz, said the angel of the Lord, utterly curse its inhabitants, because they did not come to help the Lord to the help of the Lord against the warriors." So I want you to think about a little bit about what is going on here. So the angel of the Lord is talking about curse Meroz. Any idea? Any ideas here about this?
Who is Meroz again?
Meroz is a place.
Oh.
We know it's a place because you can look in the context, and it says, utterly curse its inhabitants in verse 23. So really this is the angel of the Lord, and he's uttering a curse, which is really an utterance of harm or misfortune to come upon them. And it's really about, a disaster coming upon the inhabitants of Meroz. And so then we got to think about, why is there a curse? Well, the verse tells us. Why didn't they? At the end of verse 23, why is it that the angel of the Lord, which is God, why is he issuing a curse for Meroz?
They didn't come to help.
Okay, so if Meroz is a place that is near the battlefield, that's what the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia, and it's occupied by Israel. And it seems like they were very close to the battle area, but they didn't come for the fight. Some of these tribes were further away. They would have to come further away to get this battle. And here you have this village, this city of God's people. There's a battle going on nearby, and they're sitting it out. They're busy doing whatever they're doing, their daily course of living, right?
So just as a side question, what tribe would they have belonged to?
Well,
does it say? 'Cause I'm like, how do you know? Is it one of the ones we read about earlier where they didn't come?
Yeah. The problem with this is we don't know exactly where this place is, but this place was near where the battle took place. But that's it. We just don't know exactly where it is.
And I assume we never hear of this city again after this?
I don't believe so. I mean, I have a reference Bible here in the side margin, and I don't have any reference for Meroz other than right here.
They really were cursed then.
Yeah. So, they just, it seems that even though there's a disappointment with these other tribes, the fact that these guys were so close to this battle and they did a no-show in the judgment of the angel of the Lord, this was inexcusable. These guys, this was the easiest for these guys to be there, and they could have came. They just didn't. And so the idea that, in a great time of need, they really didn't come running. And that was just considered inexcusable by the angel of the Lord. Okay, so there's no questions. The last section is, we're talking about verses 24 through 27, and it's really talking about Jael. And this is the woman, of course, that finished off the last Canaanite, Sisera, the commander of the army. So Ryan, if you want to read 24 through 27.
I don't think you've given Jenna a chance to read.
Well, she doesn't want to because her allergies.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So 24 through what?
27.
Most blessed of women is Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. Most blessed is she of women in the tent. He asked for water and she gave him milk. In a magnificent bowl she brought him curds. She reached out her hand for the tent peg and her right hand for the workman's hammer. Then she struck Sisera, she smashed his head, and she shattered and pierced his temple. Between her feet he bowed, he fell, he lay. Between her feet he bowed, he fell. Where he bowed, there he fell dead.
Okay, so here, Deborah now lavishes praise upon Jael for killing Sisera, the commander in charge of the Canaanite army. Remember, this goes back to what Deborah the prophet said, that the honor of killing Sisera would, in chapter 4, verse 9, would go to a woman. And now, we know that it was Jael, and so she is really being praised. Again, this song really commends those who really stepped up and participated in the battle. You have Meroz just being cursed because they didn't show up. And here, at the end of the battle, there's one man left, and he's the commander of all the Canaanite forces. She's not intimidated by him. Remember, he shows up, he's exhausted, he asks for water, she gave him milk. Basically, he says, if anybody's looking for me, stand by the tent door, say you haven't seen me. And of course, she really single-handedly, took down the commander, which would probably be one of the greatest soldiers of the forces. So she is being commended for that. And so basically here where it says verse 27, it says, between her feet he bowed, he fell, he lay. And it's almost sort of like, how you would fight in an ancient battle with swords and stuff like that. And essentially you would kill your opponent, they would sort of just drop right before you. And here sort of we have something like this, sort of being portrayed, other than, basically she was able to, take him out and kill him. So she is being praised because, she really was a soldier, even though she wasn't. She took out, the commander.
I assume is a part of the reason why she gave him milk was because he was tired, and that, supposedly, a lot of people, it helps put you to sleep.
Yeah, it never really says. He asked for water because if you're really thirsty, milk is better than nothing, but it's not really going to quench your thirst.
Yeah, I mean.
But she, we don't know. Did they not have water there, or she's like, well, tough cookies. They don't have water. I'm going to give you milk.
Look at that. If he's real sleepy, you drink a glass of milk before bed, and
and maybe she's like, well, I've got milk right here. And so she, and that maybe because she wanted to make sure that he was no longer a threat before she tried to essentially, assassinate him, because boy, if he was still going, it might have been the other way around.
Yeah.
So I think it shows her bravery, and especially when you highlight the ones that never even showed up to fight. So she is really being commended for that. Okay, let's go through 28 through 31 here. It says, out of the window she looked and lamented, the mother of Sisera, through the lattice. Why does his chariot delay in coming? Why do the hoof beats of his chariot tarry? Her princes would answer her. Indeed, she repeats herself. Indeed, she repeats her words to herself. Are they not finding? Are they not dividing the spoil? A maiden, 2 maidens for every warrior. To Sisera, a spoil of dyed work, embroidered, dyed work of double embroidery on the neck of each spoiler. And so we'll keep verse 31 for last. So this is kind of hard to follow as we kind of go through this. And what you have here is Deborah, in her song here, has an imaginative picture of what's going back home where Sisera is. And in this imaginative picture, she is imagining the mother of Sisera, waiting for him to return a conqueror from battle. Remember, this should have been a done deal. I mean, the Canaanites had every advantage, and all the chariots, and all these men, and the problem is Sisera is not back yet. And so what Deborah is doing is really showing the anxiety, imagining Sisera's mother back home waiting, he hasn't come yet. And so the mother starts to sort of say, well, perhaps it's this, why he's not back, perhaps it's that. In other words, she doesn't want to entertain really what the inevitable, the real answer is. So she says, she's looking out the lattice of window. Why does his chariot delay, verse 28, in coming? And so, why aren't we hearing the hoofbeats of the chariot? Why aren't we hearing everybody returning? Verse 29, her wise princess would answer her, indeed, repeats it. In other words, they're sort of like, yeah, where are they? Why aren't we here? And then the mother says, are they not finding? Are they not dividing the spoil? Well, maybe they're still, the battle's over, and now it's about really collecting the spoils and dividing them up. And so we're talking about the idea when you conquer, the idea that you would have women that would be captured. Those would be they would be taken as spoils of war. He also talks about dyed clothing, which would be very valuable. Embroidered clothing, this would be stuff that the rich people would wear. These would be the things that they would collect as sort of war spoils. And so she's saying, well, maybe they're just still going through all the spoils. They've had such a great amount of spoils. Yeah, that could possibly it. It's just, that's probably why they're delaying, because they're still getting all the spoils. And so the mother's trying to convince her that the worst hasn't happened, that there's some other reason besides the fact that he died.
Do we know how old Sisera was? Because these verses make him sound really young if his mother's waiting for him and not a wife.
Well, he's old enough to be a soldier in a battle and a commander, which seems to suggest that he's older than the typical soldier. So somebody who would be able to wield a sword and fight himself. So, I mean, we're only guessing that. Why it's not talking about his wife, we don't know. This is Deborah's song, and this is her way of sort of looking back at it. So why not a wife? We don't. Was he married? We don't know. But he certainly had a mother. So yeah, we're trying to ask questions that we're not really going to get the answers. But we sort of get the idea that people are expecting them. Just like David came back from his battles, and the people were celebrating and things like that. And this is what the mother's waiting to do. Welcome her son back from a victorious battle. The only problem is they're not hearing the hooves of horses, the chariots. Her son hasn't returned. And so all she has left to really console herself is, well, maybe he's just late. And the other women, they're like, yeah, maybe he's just late. So finally, verse 31, Deborah sings, thus let all the enemies perish, O Lord, but let those who love him be like the rising of the sun in its might. And the land was undisturbed for 40 years. So this was a great victory. The land, now we have 40 years that they're not going to have any problems, which means that God's people are essentially loyal for extensive period of this time before, unfortunately, this cycle is going to repeat itself in chapter 6. So any questions about the Song of Deborah?
So I have a question about the lady who killed Sisera.
Okay.
Would it have been like a sin in those days for her to have killed somebody? Like it's a woman,
Oh,
she's not in the battlefield. So would it have been considered a sin?
I wouldn't say it's a sin. You're talking about jail?
Yeah.
Obviously, she's being commended for it. The Old Testament never said anything that, like it would be wrong for, a woman to kill, somebody in a situation like this where it's an enemy of war. Obviously, it would be a sin if it was murder, just like if a man committed murder, it'd been a sin if a woman committed murder. But you're talking about essentially in ancient times, women just really didn't have a part in an army. They just didn't have a role in the army. When they figured out how many troops that they had for battle, they weren't counting women, they were counting men. And so it's very unusual, but it wouldn't have been a sin. We would know that it was, if we had read something in the law of Moses. We don't see anything like that. And the fact that she's being commended for that, really her bravery, the fact that this was an enemy of war, she didn't sit on her hands. She didn't do what some of these other guys did. She basically became part of the solution, to conquer the Canaanites. It would just been very unusual is what that would be. So that's a good question. So before we get into the next chapter, just sort of try to think about this. The Bible is supposed to be something that we're to read. So if we're reading through the book of Judges and we read through Judges 5 here, we spend some time talking about, what it means and all that. Do you see anything here that, in other words, what relevance does this have to my life today? What we see here in chapter 5.
It makes me kind of think of how we were reading about how not all of the tribes were united in this.
Okay.
You could apply it in a smaller level to us as Christians.
Okay.
Or some of us are more diligent to, be, here every Sunday and
Okay.
Wednesdays, and then you got some that aren't it's not as much of a priority. I'm just kind of using it
Yeah.
as one example.
Sure.
But you look at it from that perspective.
Well,
If you basically are not applying yourself, what value are you contributing?
So we could make that, the idea of the church, and the idea is if you sort of think about, this is a battle to defeat the enemies. Obviously, what we are doing is we're obviously involved with a spiritual battle, but the church is supposed to work as a team. If the church is supposed to evangelize, if the church is supposed to be doing various things of service, and you only have a certain portion of the church doing that, that essentially makes those who are not involved look kind of bad, because the work of the church belongs to the church, which is really the individual Christians. Everybody has a part in the success of the church, and so we would ask ourselves, which one are we? Are we with the guys that are busy rolling up our sleeves and really doing what we're supposed to do? Or are we those sort of sitting on our hands? I think that would be one obvious application that we could make, is say, maybe we need to consider our ways and make sure that we are really helping to advance the kingdom. I think another thing, when we think about the song here, we sing songs as a church, and we sing songs like Victory in Jesus, and the idea is we sing about that because that's really about really talking about celebrating a victory and religious experience. The idea is because of what Jesus did on the cross, his victory over the cross, we've essentially been set free from our sins and essentially enjoy salvation. And so while they were singing about freedom from a physical enemy, we sing about freedom that we have from a spiritual enemy, and that's really sin and Satan. We've been sort of redeemed from that. So when we sing these songs, this is really our song. We sing a song of Deborah. This is our song, really. These songs about the victory in Jesus and all these different things are things that we're recalling historical facts that should have relevance in our lives today, and really want to call us back to to make sure that we're being loyal to Christ and that we're not falling short of what Christ would have for our lives. Any other observations that you see from chapter 5? Okay, I would say that we could see probably another observation in verse 8 when he says, the new gods were chosen, and Israel chose new gods. And really, you know, the thing about it is this never had to happen, where the Canaanites had, you know, this oppression over these people for 20 years, but they chose new gods. So the question would be to us is, if we invite sin into our life, we're really serving a different God in a way. I mean, we're serving Satan if we're practicing sin, and ultimately, you know, we are going to suffer the consequences in this life to whatever extent, but certainly in the next life. And so, you know, from this song, the people of Israel should have learned a lesson so there isn't any more cycles. I mean, they're going to sing this song, but we're going to see them repeat the cycle. And there's a danger that we have as Christians, that if we're not really committed to Christ, then it's so easy to sort of, and turning away from the world is so easy for us to sort of slide back into a practice of sin. So I think there are a few observations that we can make from it which really make it relevant to us today. Instead of sort of just leaving it in its historical context and say, well, that was then, you know, that was good for them, but there's nothing there for us. I think there are things that we can take away from there because we are God's people today. And so we make application to these things where we can, so that we can be challenged to be where we should be in our relationship with God and not really fall away from God. Okay, anything else? If not, then guess that'll be it for tonight. So I want to thank those who joined us via YouTube. When you see the video, hopefully it'll be encouragement to you as you read through chapter 5 of the Song of Deborah and consider what it has to say. God bless you, and we hope to have another video for you a week from today.